Hello, Madam.
Hello.
Thank you for staying up. You are in France, if I understood you correctly, not in London now.
I'm in France now, yes.
Yes, we greatly appreciate your participation in this international forum. Would you please provide a brief account what you basically do officially, unofficially? Go ahead.
Sure. The way the roundtable is going to work is we have a number of people from different areas, from political science to journalism to religious studies and so on, that are coming here to basically talk to you guys about Syria and Iraq and how we're covering what we're talking about, how do we think about it. And the way we're going to work it out is each one's going to have a short time, about 5 to 7 minutes, to present their side of the argument, their side of the topic. And we're going to start that by introducing Professor Yousef Baker from our Cal State Long Beach International Studies program, who's going to be talking about globalization and development.
I want to thank all of you guys for being here, especially since it's week 15 and you stayed for a panel that's about 3 hours long. So that really shows a scholarly maturity on your end, and I really appreciate that. It's probably going to be very hard to give a very sophisticated argument in 5 to 7 minutes. So rather than do that, I want to kind of give you 3 major points to kind of tease your curiosity with, and then we could engage in a conversation after if you want any more depth into it. So having said that, I think given the presentations and the conversation, I want to focus really on the sectarianism or issues of sectarianism in Iraq specifically. And what I want to argue against is that the sectarianism that you see in Iraq cannot be understood through an investigation of a religious history, or is not necessarily rooted in any way in the very in Islam itself, but rather these are conditions that are political, economic, and social. So then how do we disentangle that, and what are the political, economic, and social factors that have arisen in Iraq where we see sectarianism operating? And in that conversation, there is two different things that you can think about. One is the problems of the Iraqi elites themselves and how they're culpable in the issue. And I'm not going to talk about that because I think that you could hear that in a wider array, and there's a lot of focus on Iraqis and what Iraqis do. What I want to focus on is the role of the United States and the British and the so-called international community in developing sectarianism. So I have shown elsewhere, and I argue elsewhere in my work, that the American occupation built the juridical, that means the legal framework for a neoliberal state that was integrated into the global economy. So the war in Iraq wasn't about American economic interests, but rather global economic interests. But this is a longer argument. The occupation was able to also get the consent of the Iraqi political elites for that very project. However, the US occupation was not able to build a very stable Iraqi state. And some 3 years after President Obama announced that all American troops had pulled out of Iraq, the president finds himself in a situation where he is ratcheting up American military presence there. In his primetime address announcing the American strategy regarding the Islamic State, President Obama declared, quote, that American power could make a decisive difference, but we cannot do for Iraqis what they must do for themselves, unquote. In fact, when it comes to the Iraqi state, the American and British post-withdrawal rhetoric claims and asserts that every success of the Iraqi state is due to the occupation. Yet every failure of the state of Iraq is a result of the ineptitude of the Iraqis, their culture of corruption, their rampant sectarianism, and so forth. So what is good comes from the occupation, and what is bad, well, the Iraqis have to do some soul searching to figure out what's wrong with that. I argue, rather, that the current manifestation of sectarianism in Iraqi society and the deadlock of the state was structured by and is rooted in the American occupation policies themselves. The legal foundations of the Iraqi state, combined with the US counterinsurgency policies, created an Iraqi state that was susceptible to sectarianism. The occupation might have aimed for a stable Iraqi government, but its actions were responsible for creating the opposite. To show this, I want to focus our attention on the period between the start of the invasion and ending in December 2005, when the first Iraqi elections after the passage of the Constitution was held. Within that time period, I will highlight three processes that I argue structured the sectarian nature of the Iraqi state, as well as what has become the episodic sectarian ruptures in Iraqi society. So, these three processes include, one, the promotion of sectarian political forces by the US occupation. Two, the policy that's called the de-Baathification policy. And third, the creation of a weak Confederate Iraqi state. So just to give you, I will talk about what's called the Coalition Provisional Authority. The Coalition Provisional Authority was led by Paul Bremer, and it was the American occupation government in Iraq starting in 2003 all the way to June 2004. At that time, all power resided in the signature of Paul Bremer and the Coalition Provisional Authority. So the United States had complete control at that time. So within that time period, the first thing that I talk about, right, is the promotion of sectarian forces. So, and I'm going to start speeding up because my 5 minutes are probably going to come to an end very quickly. So the promotion of sectarian forces happened because fundamentally we perceived, the United States perceived Iraq to be a sectarian society and thus acted on Iraq as if it was a sectarian society. So you go back and you look at how the United States understood Iraq. It understood Iraq as three different groupings mainly, because they didn't really know the other types of people there. And these groups were forced together and could not be separated. So in order to deal with them, we have to deal with each group separately on an individual basis. So one of the first groups that the Americans created was the so-called Iraqi Governing Council. So the Iraqi Governing Council, they brought together Iraqi representatives, but the way they brought them together was based on a quota. So we need this many Shias, we need this many Sunnis, and we need this many Kurdish. So then in return, who goes there? The people who go, in order to get involved or to get access into the occupation time, you need to show your sectarian credentials. So this is, in my classes, we talk about Orientalism, right, in the Intro to International Studies. Orientalism, it might be dangerous academically because it doesn't get you the right empirical data, but when it comes to policy, having an Orientalist perception of the society in which you're occupying, destroying, and attempting to rebuild will have a devastating impact that could lead to loss of life. And so that's why Orientalism is so important to read. With 30 seconds left, the second reason why there is the sectarianism is created is the idea of de-Baathification. De-Baathification, the occupation came in the first two orders, Order 1, Order 2, Order 5, were about disbanding the Ba'ath Party of Saddam Hussein. But the Ba'ath Party itself, people, in order for you to have access to governmental jobs, you needed to be part of the Ba'ath Party. So right after you said that there's no more Ba'ath Party, around 16,000 people who worked in the Ministry of Education, mostly teachers, were fired. The entire army, which employed 300,000 to 400,000 people who only knew how to fight, also were disbanded. And you created a portion of the society that you said was not going to be able to be part of the new society that was being created or part of the government. So that's the second one. The third problem is the issue of the Iraqi constitution creating a weak state, and I won't have time to go into that. So if you have questions, I'll talk about that in general. So let me just conclude by saying that the CPA, through its policies, had created a sectarian and weak central government and ushered in sectarian political elites. So the legacy of the American occupation was that of governing based on sectarianism. More so than Maliki, Paul Bremer is the most sectarian leader in Iraq after Saddam Hussein, I'd argue. And it fostered and promoted a government based on sectarian allegiances. And it created laws that disqualified large segments of the population from involvement in public life. So when we think of the solutions, if we are part of the very problem that created this, then we must then interrogate how can we be part of the solution, and if we can be. By we, I mean the American state, not you guys. Thank you very much.
The next panelist that we're going to hear about is Professor Sophia Pandya from the Religious Studies Department, who's going to be talking to us about the changing situation in Turkey.
Okay, well, that's me. Okay, well, great. Well, I've been to Turkey 5 times between 2002 and 2012 to 2013. And in 2013, I was lucky enough to go to northern Iraq, to the Erbil, city of Erbil in Kurdistan, and I was also all over eastern Turkey interviewing Kurds. Kurds are the largest stateless group in the world, largest ethnic group without a state. And in Turkey, they make up about 18% of the population. But they've, you know, there's a lot of groups. There's a lot of groups that have experienced a lot of repression in Turkey. So I don't want to say that they are the most repressed group in Turkey, but maybe they are. Okay. In 1922, in 1923, when Ataturk took power in Turkey, his vision of Turkey was a monolithic Turkey which Kurdish children were asked to place their hands over their heart and say, "Thank God I was born a Turk," in the morning at school. Thank God I was born a Turk. That must have been hard if you were Kurdish. They were told that they weren't allowed to speak Kurdish in any type of public place, not allowed to study it at school, not allowed to sing Kurdish songs, no Kurdish TV stations, none of that. In fact, in Ataturk's Turkey, where everybody was Turkish, you just couldn't be anything else but Turkish. Even if you weren't Turkish, you were Turkish. You were called a mountain Turk if you were Kurdish, a mountain Turk. Okay? So those were his state-building processes. And Ataturk's state-building processes are known of as, the legacy of that is Kemalism. And Kemalists today still are very repressive of different types of people. So I have a friend who's in the Gülen movement. It's a Sufi movement, very active internationally and also in California. And she told me, if I hadn't been in this movement, I would think Kurdish people were dirty. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, I would think they were dirty and ignorant and stupid. And I was like, what? How can you say that? Don't you have multicultural education at school? Don't they teach you pluralism at school, about treating everybody the same? And she said, no, we still don't. We do not. We absolutely do not. So that woke me up. That opened my eyes. So it's very hard to be Kurdish in Turkey. So I was sort of interested in that Sufi group, the Hizmet movement, also known as the Gülen movement, and the fact that they're opening up a bunch of schools for many people. There's like 2,000 schools outside of Turkey owned by the Gülen movement, but they have opened up a lot of schools in Iraq and in Turkey, especially in the Kurdish region. Okay, and the schools, when I interviewed people, they told me that those schools are in direct competition with the PKK, and in fact, the PKK does not like the Gülen movement because the Gülen movement schools offer another type of future for another alternative activity for Kurdish youth other than joining the PKK. PKK just can't get their tentacles. It's interesting, there's so many contradictions right now, I can barely keep up. I was talking to Amir here. To be knowledgeable in this area at all, you have to read the newspaper every day, not just one newspaper, you have to read all the newspapers every day because the situation is changing so quick, and it's so, everything is so complex, a lot of contradictions are going on. So the PKK, Turks thought of them as terrorists, and they have carried out a lot of activities that many of you would say, yes, they're terrorist activities. But right now, the PKK, the United States has been having sort of a softening towards the PKK, and we're going to talk about that. I know I just have a couple seconds left, or a little bit. When I went to Iraq, I found that, first of all, I was fascinating. You know, I went to Iraq and I thought that I would have to say, I'm sorry about the war in Iraq. I'm sorry about how we bombed you guys for decades. I'm just sorry about that. But I was in Kurdistan and everybody was like, Americans, Americans. Kurdish people love Americans, by the way. You can go to, I wouldn't go to Iraq right now, but right now, you know, in general, I mean, I was there last year. Kurdish people are very friendly with American people because we killed Saddam Hussein, etc. So I found that Turkish businessmen are doing a whole lot of business in Kurdistan, which is the semi-autonomous region, Kurdish region in Iraq. Billions of dollars are flowing back and forth. So the whole antagonism that Turks and Kurds have in Turkey is not felt so much in Iraq, because money is making everything better. The Turkish businessmen are getting richer from doing business in Iraq, and the Iraqis just love the Turkish money. They're building banks, they're building malls, they're building restaurants all over the place in Iraq. So you would think that the situation in Turkey would be getting better with Turks and Kurds. Well, the interesting thing is that Erdogan, who's right now he's the president of Turkey, he was the prime minister, but he decided he wanted more power, so he decided to become a president. He actually needed the Kurds to win his election. So he gave them a lot of reforms, concessions. He gave amnesty for PKK members, let them out of jail. He said, okay, you can study Kurdish in private institutions, still no Kurdish in the public school. Don't speak Kurdish at public school. No bilingual education. But you can have public institutions. There's still some problem regarding the Cemavis, which are the religious institutions. They're not really funded by the state, even though they should be. And in fact, today, if you look at the newspaper today, there's something about that. But after he became president, and I have an article coming out about this, after he became president, I knew he would do this. I knew he would do this. He's turned again. He already got what he wants from the Kurds. He has what he wants from the Kurds. So right now, he's turning a blind eye to what ISIS is doing to the Kurds. Why would he help the Kurds? Why would he help, you know, the Kurds in Kobani? Why would he help them? Or on the ones on the mountain. The ISIS, you know, nobody really likes ISIS except ISIS. Okay, only ISIS likes ISIS. But he seems to like ISIS better than he likes the Kurds, because he's turning his blind eye and he's letting ISIS operate from within Turkey, because ultimately they're Sunni Muslims, and he thinks, he's so worried that the Kurds will get a Kurdistan in Turkey. Okay, he's worried that the Kurds, if he helps the Kurds in other places, in Syria and in Iraq, then there's Kurds in Syria, the Kurds in Iraq, maybe the Kurds in Iran, and then the Kurds in Turkey they'll carve out little pieces of those four countries and call it one big Kurdistan. And he's just really terrified of that. And so right now, they have been screwed over, and that's where I'll end.
All right, our next speaker is actually, which I'm going to do from down here. Again, my name is Paskin. I'm a professor from the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication here on campus. And I thought I would take a little bit of a different approach, although I love the fact they went before me, Sophia, because that perfectly matches. Because think about the job, as Professor Pandya said, usually we hear about these events, we hear about what's going on from the media. But how exactly do the media do that? How exactly are we able to do that? Covering foreign affairs, and I'm sure all of you guys know that, is not the easiest thing in the world at all. It's very complicated. So the first tricky part about this, for us to properly be able to bring you guys the news and what's going on across the world in areas that most people probably have no idea of the culture, no idea of the history, no idea of any of that background, is to first of all educate the public. And that involves a whole lot of research. Many people who are sent to cover those stories have to first of all make sure to educate themselves. Make sure that they know something about the culture, make sure they know something about the language, how to get around. It's easy to do that when you're in place, when you're in place that you're totally used to, that you're comfortable with. But whenever you get sent to cover a story like this, Syria and Iraq, it's not the easiest thing at all to do. You guys might know a lot about the topic, especially since you're here today listening about this. But think about the regular newspaper reader, the regular television watcher, who does not know much about this at all. You need to make sure that they understand, and they understand how important it is. That's number one. Number two, it's not the safest place at all to do that. Yes, I love covering sports. Send me to cover this UCLA game, I'll do it every time. But send me to Iraq and Syria to cover the conflicts, that's tricky. And extremely, extremely dangerous. Since the beginning of the conflicts, almost 40 journalists have been killed in Syria. More than 20 have been killed in Iraq. How do you get around that? How do you still do your job, but do it in a safe way? Remember, two very prominent deaths from journalists were the two journalists who were beheaded very publicly by ISIS. By the way, one question to you guys. What's the difference between ISIS and ISIL? Do you guys know? Because in the beginning, when newspapers started covering the event, when television stations started covering the event, we started using both terms interchangeably. We would go from one to the other, and nobody had a clue what the difference was. The New York Times, the USA Today, and most of the major publications in the country wrote a huge piece simply explaining to people the difference between the two terms so people don't get confused. Those are the kind of things that we always need to think about. And just to wrap up my part, in terms of covering the region, one change in the media that we've seen lately that's been very interesting to watch, and that's been happening since the revolution in Egypt a couple years ago, has been social media. And you guys are actually the perfect population for that. Do some of you guys go to either Facebook or Twitter to get your news? Or that's the first place you hear about things? That has become one of the major sources for news. And as a journalist, I need to learn how to do that. I need to learn that my public, my audience, is actually on Facebook, is actually on Twitter, is on YouTube. And more than anything, you guys want information now. If something happened 2 minutes ago, it needs to be on Twitter now. How do I do a good job being a journalist, reporting a story, covering the whole topic, if I need to report now and make things quick? It doesn't make life easy at all for journalists. But for you guys, for the audience, for the public, who really, really cares about what's going on, that's extremely important. And that's a little bit of how we do that. And I'm actually going to wrap up here and let you guys talk. Thank you. All right, and moving on with our program, our next presenter, our next panelist is Charlie Mahoney, professor from the Department of Political Science here at Cal State Long Beach, who's going to be talking to us about U.S. foreign policy, terrorism, and counterinsurgency. Professor Mahoney.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Sharifi for having us all here for this very enlightening forum. I've already learned a lot. I want to get across sort of 3 points or ideas about the conflict in Iraq and Syria in the brief time I have to speak. The first is a point of discourse and methodology about counterfactual reasoning or arguments or statements made in much of the policy debates that are ongoing about this conflict. The second is thinking about civil wars in the context of proxy wars, that is, civil wars in which we don't just have two opposing sides within a country fighting each other, but a very large international context going on within the civil war. That is, external supporters from different sides with large numbers of resources and funds, and what that does to civil wars like we see in Syria. Finally, I'm going to briefly just talk about the difference between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. I'm going to talk about ISIS more as being an insurgent group that uses terrorism, and why that's going to pose so many problems for whatever policy we have going forward, the international community has going forward, trying to defeat, dismantle, degrade the group. Okay, so first of all, counterfactuals. I'm going to read 3 statements to you that if you've been following the conflict with ISIS or the civil war in Syria, I'm sure that you've heard. First is, ISIS would never have emerged had the US not invaded Iraq in 2003. Second, ISIS would not be as strong as it is today if the United States had acted militarily against the Assad regime in 2013. Finally, ISIS would not be a significant threat today had Barack Obama maintained a larger US troop presence in Iraq after 2011, and had the US not supported the regime of Nouri al-Maliki for so long. So I'm sure you've probably, if you've been following the debate on TV and listened to politicians, especially if you were following elections recently, or pundits, talking heads on television, you've probably heard all those 3 statements, okay? And the thing about those statements is they may or may not be true, but they're about alternate histories that we don't live in today, okay? We had a speaker today say, he read a quote by Yogi Berra and said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. And I want to make a little addendum to that and say, counterfactuals are easy, especially about the past. So if you're going to, it's easy to make this type of argument. And it's also important, as social scientists, we want to make this type of argument. We make causal arguments. We say, variables A and B cause C, and in that we're implying a counterfactual. The problem with counterfactuals and thinking about policy is that policy is inherently a forward-looking way of thinking. A policy is about addressing a problem that exists in the future. And so when we're having debates about policy, we want to have a more problem-solving discourse rather than a critical, backward-looking discourse. I don't see that there's anything wrong with any of the counterfactuals, inherently speaking, that I talked about. Some of them might be true, but when we're talking about solutions to an ongoing civil war, going back into the past, into history, and thinking about alternate realities isn't going to be that constructive. So that's the first point I wanted to make about counterfactuals. Second point is about civil wars and proxy wars. Recent research in social science on civil wars has demonstrated that civil wars that occur in the context of a proxy war, in which there are foreign sides supporting each side, last much longer than civil wars that aren't characterized by proxy conflict, proxy outside actors supporting both sides at the same time. This is probably a pretty obvious finding, but people have recently done large-end statistical studies to demonstrate that this is, in fact, a solid finding. Okay. So if we think about, the Cold War, civil wars often lasted a long time during the Cold War because the United States and the Soviet Union or Cuba or China would be supporting opposing sides, providing resources, funds, intelligence, training to both sides, and conflicts could go on for decades. We think about conflicts in Angola, Central America, and Guatemala, El Salvador, all over the world. Civil wars lasted a long time during the Cold War because of this. In Afghanistan recently, we've seen the support of the Taliban by Pakistan, ISI, and other actors in Pakistan contribute to the durability of the Taliban. And the United States, on the other side, supporting the nascent Afghani government. In Syria, we have an extremely complicated international context and proxy war, with very powerful actors on both sides. This means that, unfortunately, if we're looking at Syria, not Iraq for a second, it's a very, I don't have to tell you this, but it's a very intransigent conflict, okay? On one side, we have Iran, Russia, Hezbollah supporting the Assad regime, and we have the United States and various Gulf states, and some other actors supporting the opposition forces. What does this mean? If we look at the past, it means that we have external actors with a lot of resources, a lot of intelligence, a lot of arms, a lot of funding, supporting either side, and it's not a good recipe for a successful outcome. Finally, counterinsurgency versus, is it 2 minutes or wrap up?
I give it a couple extra minutes there, so come on.
Okay. Counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism. When we think about counterterrorism from the American foreign policy perspective, which is one of the things that I study, the areas I study, we're talking about trying to prevent attacks on American soil or American assets around the world. And that's a certain type of activity which involves intelligence gathering, border protection, hardening or securing targets that might be likely targets for terrorist organizations. What we're dealing with in Iraq and Syria with respect to ISIS is an insurgent organization that uses the strategy of terrorism. Right now, ISIS doesn't have, its fundamental objective isn't to try and carry out attacks against the United States on United States soil. Its fundamental objective is to consolidate control over territory that it already controls, and then to begin acting as the governing entity, the sovereign in that territory. So what we've learned in recent years, and throughout several, couple hundred years of counterinsurgency, is that counterinsurgency, rather than counterterrorism, is very difficult, costly, intensive type of conflict. It involves this is the military jargon, U.S. military jargon, a clear, hold, build approach, which requires clearing insurgents out of an area, holding the area, and then protecting the population. Whoever does this, or who has to do this with ISIS, because this is what will have to be done to clear them out of the territory that they hold, whether it's Iraqi forces, American forces, hopefully not, or whoever, is going to have to go through this process. It's a slow, long, intensive, costly process. And so I hate to be so pessimistic, but that is the reality of what's going to have to happen. And someone is going to have to do that with respect to ISIS. So I'll end there because we're out of time, and I'm happy to answer questions about specific policy options for the United States and the international community in the Q&A.
Next, we have Professor Larry N. George, also from the CSULB Political Science Department, who's going to be talking to us about international relations, Syria, and Iraq.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So one of the problems with coming at the end of a long train of esteemed scholars is that you can count on them having said much of what you were planning to say, so better than I'm capable of doing so. Expressing my gratitude for that, at the same time, I'll try to focus on just a couple of points that I was initially planning to dilate on at more length. But these have to do with the general question of this dynamic about ISIS being a state, or whether it's capable, or the Islamic State functioning as a state, and how outside actors have played a role in seeking to shape ISIS's, I'll call it the Islamic State's capacities in this regard, because I think it attracts our attention to the ways that much of the complicity for the current situation really lies still very much in the hands of the United States, as Yousef Baker and others have pointed out. not simply because of the U.S.'s occupation and the consequences of that, but because of the larger grand strategy the U.S. pursues in the Middle East right now. I'll give you a couple of examples here. So the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia indirectly leads to a situation in which the Saudis have a great deal of sort of free hand in seeking to expand their position in the region. And one of the ways they've been doing this, and it's kind of paradoxical, so you have to bear with me a little bit here. One of the ways they've been doing this is through seeking to influence the direction in which the Islamic State is evolving. As most of you know probably, Islamic State is an organization that's very thin on the ground. It rules primarily through terror, through mobility, the ability to decide the point and location of its military targets, its military attacks, and through intimidation and through seizure and control over funding sources of funding for its operations. Not just oil fields, but electrical power plants, granary depots and grain fields, as well as dams and electrical facilities and the like, and also kidnapping for ransom. But originally ISIS's funding and a certain amount of its manpower as well came from Saudi Arabia. Not necessarily the Saudi government, but wealthy and powerful Saudi individuals and networks, with the tolerance of the Saudi government, the Saudi royal family at minimum, and from Qatar, a significant number of private actors in Qatar as well. And so the question arises: well, what do they have at stake in this? What are they up to here? One of the things that's important to understand is that the Saudis are playing a very dangerous game. They're in a sense of sort of riding on a tiger. They are concerned to use groups like ISIS to expand their influence in the region, and at the same time, they're very worried that the presence of groups like this could redound back and become a problem for their continued rule and the legitimacy of their rule in Saudi Arabia itself. This is a problem that they inherited from the long struggle of Al-Qaeda, which is, as you probably know, Al-Qaeda was initially formed as an organization which had a number of prongs, but one of which was to prosecute the war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but also try to overthrow the Saudi government. And so while the Saudis are willing to support Islamist groups when they serve their interests, they're very afraid that these groups could and will become a threat to their own position in the region and even their own rule over the peninsula. The question arises: well, why do they fund them from the beginning, or why did they permit money from Saudi Arabia to go into the initial funding? The reason, to a certain extent, I think now, is that they anticipated what's been happening right now, which is that much of the cadre, much of the political groups within ISIS and the fighters are increasingly coming not from the Arab countries in the region. They're not ethnically Arab as much as they were at the beginning. They're now increasingly coming in from the North Caucasus region, from Dagestan, from Chechnya, and these are the same sources as many of the fighters that fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, of course. And the newer groups are a much more international brigade. You've probably seen in the news the recent evidence that there's quite a flow into the region from Europe itself. French and British fighters who've gone to participate in the insurgency, and who've done what many of the other fighters from the North Caucasus have done, which is essentially declare themselves internationalists. They burn their passports. They've declared themselves to be fighting on behalf of what actually terrifies the Saudi government, which is an international state. That is a state whose boundaries would transgress those that were established after the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the complication here is that as Islamic State establishes itself as an increasingly authentically, or at least rhetorically, internationalist movement. The plan of Saudi Arabia, which was initially to try to bring in fighters like this, precisely because they wouldn't have local contacts, they wouldn't have ethnic roots in the communities in which they were operating, they wouldn't have a state, they wouldn't have personal or group stakes ahead of time in the region, and thus they would be more easily manipulable by the Saudis. What's happening, however, with the nature of the internationalist rhetoric now that's developing in the Islamic State, and its ability now to bond together these fighters from all over the Muslim majority world now, one of the effects of this is that it's actually creating the possibility now for the first time for a genuinely regional insurgency that could destabilize the other governments in the region in a way that because of the sectarianism and the ethnic identification of such groups in the past, that threat has been limited. And so what I want to leave you with is a thought that we may be seeing something actually genuinely new here, something that was fomented initially by the Saudis for their own purposes, and which was part of their strategy of sectarianization of the contest, but which now, because of the very international character of the Islamic State's own self-understanding, its own rhetoric and so forth, may actually be coming back to haunt them, and indirectly U.S. policymakers as well in the region.
And our last panelist for the day is our own Professor Amir Sharifi from the Department of Linguistics, who's going to be talking to us about providing an innovative democratic experiment beyond nationalism.
Thank you. So I'm going to take you to a city under siege. Syrian Kurds actually emerged from nowhere, from obscurity, about perhaps more than 2 months ago, when the city appeared on the world map for the first time. The city had come under the siege of the Islamic State, as a consequence of which 200,000 had to flee and seek sanctuary in neighboring Turkey. The US and Turkish officials, some of you may recall, spoke of the imminent and inevitable fall of the city. Yet it put up a fierce fight, which is still going on, against the capture of the city. It has become a symbol and source of inspiration for all freedom lovers around the world. Particularly Kobani women's legendary resistance has astounded all. We have seen documentaries of these women on mainstream media. Kurdish diaspora communities in Europe and the US have played a major role in bringing attention to and creating solidarity with the defenders of the city, who initially lacked any form of international support. Only after the city was about to fall, and actually the ISIS forces had reached within the walls of the city, that the United States hesitantly and perhaps belatedly came to their help and began to work with the Kurdish Democratic Union Party, or PYD, and its affiliates. Demographically, Kurds constitute about 10% of the Syrian diverse population. They speak Kurmanji, an Indo-European language, and mostly live in northern Syria, along with the Iraq and Turkish border. The Kurds of Syria, who call themselves, or the area of Rojava, Western Kurdistan, have experienced perhaps they did experience the first awakening in 2004, and their movement was brutally crushed by Assad. They suffered massive marginalization, politically, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, rendering political expression or mobilization impossible. Hundreds of thousands of them had been actually deprived of the right to citizenship, treated as second-class citizens during the 1960s and 1970s. There had been attempts to assimilate to assimilate them through draconian denial of their fundamental rights. About 200,000 of them were actually labeled as foreigners in 2008. 80,000 were called Makhtumin, or the so-called concealed. Decades of brutal repression had made it impossible for any sort of cultural and linguistic expression. Anything published in Kurdish would be confiscated, and whoever was found in the possession of any Kurdish publication would be imprisoned. In the 1970s, for example, Damascus began changing place names from Kurdish to Arabic. Arabs were enticed to resettle along a security belt which was erected, a military zone along the Syrian borders with Turkey and Iraq. So families and relatives were separated. Political marginalization accentuated with economic and cultural marginalization continued throughout the 80s, 90s, and until very recent times. That gives you a brief background about Kobani today. After the Syrian troops pulled out from largely Kurdish areas in March 2011, Kurds embarked on building and promoting an autonomy in 3 Kurdish enclaves, Kobani, Jazeera, and Afrin. Despite lack of experience with political struggle, they began to develop the necessary institutions. Kurdish culture and language began to flourish, and for the first time, education in Kurdish was offered. But these very limited fundamental rights are still in grave danger, and they are being viciously attacked by the Islamic State. The recent history of Kurds in this region points an undeniable fact out that in the absence of international solidarity and support, central governments in these areas would do everything in their power basically to undo what they have accomplished. Nor has the international assistance so far been sufficient to help the Kurds of Syria halt the ISIS onslaught. The anti-Assad forces of all political persuasions, this is interesting, entrenched in exclusionary ideologies of their own, have been hostile to the recognition of Kurdish demands and rights. That is why Kurdish demands and problems of ethnic and religious groups remain marginal to the Syrian opposition and their political discourse. The Kurdish paradox lies in the fact that neither Damascus nor the Syrian opposition has recognized the Kurdish call for a decentralized, representative, and federal Syria. The Kurdish constitution wants to ensure that the Alawites, Druze, and Kurds and other minorities have equal rights. To be able to teach Kurdish in their autonomous region is definitely a political triumph which they are defending with their lives. They have created and run self-governed administrative units called cantons and mobilized a grassroots democracy in which all citizens partake freely. And what is striking is that they have successfully carried out social revolution, not on the basis of ethnic division, but mobilizing the marginalized communities women actively and directly participate in and contribute to changing the status quo, social order structures, and they have created open political structures. To wrap up, Kobani is very important. Its survival is important. It is in a precarious condition, but it has re-energized Kurdish diaspora communities and the call for Kurdish basically unity. In essence, Kobani has created a new sense of activism and unity among Kurdish forces from different regions. I argue that this form of grassroots democracy is a fundamental transformation in the Middle East and represents symbols and signs of a profound social revolution threatening the status quo, regimented structures, and exclusionary beliefs. I propose that the likelihood of the survival of Kobani, however, would depend greatly on international solidarity and support. This movement has only armed itself in self-defense. The secret of their survival and resilience lies in the communal mobilization, direct and inclusive political action, ethnic diffusion beyond traditional in-group specific cohesion, sectarian and narrow nationalism so prevalent in this region. Kobani, to a great extent, has transcended these boundaries.
when we're going to invite all the guys to ask questions of panelists. Can I put one last round of applause to Professor Sharifi who organized? All right, on that note, this is the part where we basically open it up for you guys. We can ask questions too, but we would much rather have questions coming from you after you heard basically 2.5 hours of talk about this. Anything you want to ask either a specific panelist or the whole panel in general, including these who's sitting down here, you're please more than welcome to. We have mics up here, although I'm hoping that if you just raise your hand and stand up, we might be able to hear you. But please ask questions.
Please come up here.
All right, since they're being shy, I have a question. We got a little bit of a sense, a better sense of this, listening to you guys talk about it today. But for many people, the notion of ISIS or the current conflict in Syria, the region, seems to have come kind of out of nowhere for the people who are not directly involved with it. Is that a good assessment? Is that somebody's fault? Is it a fault in terms of education or politics, or was that done on purpose? How come for many people this came out of nowhere and just became this huge thing overnight?
I don't know if it came out of nowhere, actually. I'll just say something brief and let the political scientists go on. But I think a lot of people were predicting that after the war in Iraq, that you would see more extremism. War in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, you get a resurgence of really extremist movements, and that's what you have. And so you have the sort of the conquered or Sunni minority in Iraq, very angry, losing power, and a small group of them makes an alliance with Al Qaeda. Becomes more, even Al Qaeda is afraid of ISIS now, right? And so I see ISIS as something that people have been screaming about. People have been saying, this is going to happen, this is what's going to happen when you do this. And I see them as a hyper-masculinity movement of guys that are just really pissed off that they've had power taken away from them. I think that explains a lot of the rapes that you're seeing. As a hyper-masculinity group, it also explains why some women are, like you see teenage girls going, oh, they look kind of cool. Because they're the guns and knives and everything. But I don't think they came out of it nowhere. I don't think so.
The reason they're surprising to me, or the surprise that people have had of the experience of their emergence, is that it happened so quickly. And I think in some ways it's the perfect storm in terms of the conditions present in Iraq for the group to arise so quickly. If we look at many insurgencies, take years, decades to develop the control of territory and the number of supporters that ISIS has. In this particular case, you have the remnants of a pre-existing Sunni insurgency that rose up in Iraq between 2005 and 2008. So it didn't emerge out of nowhere. In the sense, there was that pre-existing extremist population, and you couple that with, as has been mentioned previously, the ex-remnants of the Ba'ath Party and military, and you combine those two together, and you already have a battle-hardened group that knows military tactics. Then you couple that with a perfect scenario for an insurgency is a safe haven, right? And that's what exists in Syria. Insurgencies love safe havens or chaotic territory because there's no sovereign entity that can sort of police them, carry out a counterinsurgency against them, provide any government services. So you have pre-existing organizations, Ba'ath Party, ex-Ba'ath Party members, ex-Sunni extremists who fought against the Americans and the Iraqi government, 2005 to 2008, 9, 10. And then you couple that with the chaos in Syria, and I think that explains the very fast emergence of the group. But obviously you can trace back organizational histories and lineages for several years. It didn't just, you know, poof, it was there.
I would simply add that, in addition to the information, that the group had basically been around for about 8 years. A year ago, a bit more than a year ago, it took over the city of Raqqa in northern Syria. So it was known. I think what was surprising was, one, how swiftly and quickly and surprisingly took over so much of Iraq in Mosul. That was number one. And the other was, it was the perfect foil to justify U.S. military intervention, so it got hyped even more. There's plenty of evil, human rights violating groups claiming to fight in the name of Islam that are carrying out as bad atrocities or worse, but this was one that served as a justification for the latest U.S. war. And that's one of the other reasons it seems like they're particularly evil.
If I may add just, sorry, if I could add just one point too, is that, so we were surprised by ISIS, how it emerged so given that we were surprised, we know actually very little about ISIS. Everything we know about ISIS, most of it is based on what ISIS says about ISIS. So that I would actually argue that there isn't a lot of, we do not know how coherent the ideology of ISIS is within the rank and file of the people, the foot soldiers that operate in there. So that, for example, ISIS is a category that we impose on a wide swath of different groups that have come together to do something. Much the same way that when we looked at the Iraqi insurgency in 2005, we talked about it as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and thus did not see the different groupings that occurred underneath. So that ISIS also, part of the emergence and its power is the fact that it, like Professor Galvin said previously, it includes a tactical alliance with various different social forces. So the Naqshbandi army of Izzat al-Duri in Iraq, which is the former Baathists. There is various tribes, various different groupings that are disenfranchised, that then allied with ISIS because they're the strongest force that could maybe get them their political goals. And so the reason why I say that is because it's very important to understand that in that it's easy to say they're ISIS, they are outside of civilization and outside of everything that we could even deal with, thus everybody needs to be ignored. And there's no political solution, thus there's a military solution. And I would argue, if you understand ISIS as a coming together of all of these different kinds of groups that include some of the folks that are very dangerous or have very dangerous ideologies, then you could see the possibility for a political solution that in actuality is the only solution. So the various tribes in Iraq, or the Naqshbandi army and the Baathists, you need to develop some kind of a political solution with them. And this is coming from somebody whose entire family has suffered from the Baathists. So I have no love for the party or its ideology, but rather as a way of understanding. So there is some people that you could break that tactical alliance. If you could break that tactical alliance, ISIS could actually diffuse into much smaller groupings, because those different people who are in tactical alliance with them have specific demands that you could kind of get at. Whereas, as Professor Larry George was talking about, some of the smaller group of ISIS has regional aspirations that you might have a harder time dealing with if you are, and I'm talking from the perspective of the Iraqi government, let's say.
Yeah, briefly, I think that's exactly right. That ISIS is, in some ways, an external construct. It's not. It's not. It should be seen as a coherent insurgency with a clear ideology and an organizational cadre. It's actually a very politically immature group. Certainly, if you contrast it with sort of national liberation movements during the period of the Cold War and so forth, it's a function to a significant extent of the way that Baathist rule operated, which was to essentially issue orders and to reward those who obeyed the orders, who enforce them, and to ruthlessly punish those who resisted. And that leads to a social order in which civil society is very repressed. And so, to organize an effective resistance requires a set of abilities and skills and training and experience. It takes a long time to develop, and under Ba'athist rule, there was never time for that to, and never an opportunity for that to occur. And then under the U.S. occupation, the violence prevented anything like that from developing. So the real question, to a certain extent, is why isn't there anything besides this sort of one-upping kind of violence that we see among these organizations? And it's largely because of the experience of Baathism and the subsequent occupation by the United States. It also means that those who were involved in at least those who were participants early on, who had been affiliated with the Ba'athist movement, themselves don't have much experience in governing in a way other than terror. I mean, the way that they don't have any experience in winning the hearts and minds, or compromise, or negotiation, or acting as neutral arbitrators in regional and local conflicts and so forth. They don't have that kind of ordinary political experience that, for example, insurgencies in Cuba or in Vietnam were able to develop by coming from within the population itself. And again, that's why this problem I was looking at earlier about the increasing influence of foreign fighters now is really beginning to aggravate that, and it's something that we need to keep an eye on.
If I may just add one more thing to the multitude of factors that were enumerated, I think the very fact that basically the Iraqi government is sectarian and was exclusionary basically in nature contributed to the rise and spread of such an ideology whose pernicious, basically entrenched dimensions have yet to unfold for themselves. I wouldn't say that they have a cohesive ideology, the maxims of which they claim to have borrowed from the Quran, but as they go along, they are trying to redefine basically these pragmatically. And they have arisen from political, basically, skirmishes, chaos, disillusionments, disenchantments, and unfortunately the Middle East will not really rest in peace as long as these so-called national states, if they can bear any meaning, concretely or symbolically, insist on being exclusionary and sectarian. Nothing really has changed in Iraq, despite claims that the new government is going to be more inclusive, and the U.S. administration's policy in support of the new government, I don't know to what extent it would create the fertile ground for political democracy or equal representation of the Iraqi ethnic and religious groups. It is not moving in that direction.
I guess I just have a quick background question. I didn't get to catch the beginning of the lecture because I was in class. But so I guess it's just kind of like a background kind of geek out. I don't know if anybody else has this type of question, but what is the difference between like when the media discusses the Islamic State versus Islamic State of Iraq and Syria versus the Islamic State of, I think it's Iraq and Levantine or something like that? What is the difference between these terms? And I guess it's just no question.
Well, it is confusing because the group keeps changing its name, and the media and the government keep using different translations. The original group in Iraq was the Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Both names were used. When the group migrated to Syria in 2011 at the beginning of the Arab Spring uprising, it rebranded itself. Think of Coke and Pepsi, right? They became the Islamic State in Iraq, and later the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham, which is translated sometimes as the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. That's where ISIL comes from, that acronym. The Levant refers to the area that today is Lebanon, Syria, that part of the world. So it was called, by its own definition, was called either ISIS or ISIL, depending on how you translate it. And then to make matters even more confusing, earlier this year they changed their name to the Islamic State, or IS. They're all the same group.
I just thought it was particularly confusing as you know, especially when you have something as broad as the Islamic State. You know, it can seem as like I personally dislike that term in the sense that there's nothing other than state, other than the word Islamic, and so it's just so confusing and vague. And so when people are reporting about this, I'm just like not sure who it refers to. But I guess it makes sense that even the group is kind of trying to define itself.
So it was an attempt basically to redefine themselves, meaning that we are beyond geographical boundaries. And it was delimiting the first basically term.
I feel like a lot of these, or like the people that try to organize groups, or the people that try to organize power, tend to use these issues of identity to get people to go towards them, to believe them, to support them. That's fine. Yeah, okay. So I guess my question is, like, since many, like a lot of different aspects of identity are played against each other, and also that the issue of identity itself defines itself as much by what it's not as what it is. So there's national identity, which is opposed to sectarian identity or religious or ethnic identity. So I guess for any of you that want to answer, what do you think the chances are of like sort of people bridging those gaps or developing like a human identity maybe, and how can you overcome the forces where the people at the top really have an interest in keeping these people separate in order to define themselves against something so they support them and their violent goals or whatever that is?
Diana Eck has written in 2003 about religious exclusivism and religious inclusivism. So the problem with being too inclusive, or you have to think of it as a spectrum. So if you're on the exclusivist spectrum, then you think everybody's going to hell. So since they're going to hell, why don't you speed it up, help God out, and go kill them since they're going to hell anyway. So that would be like ISIS, right? We can call them way over here. And then the inclusivists, can eat with everybody, can touch everybody, can go to your party. They don't think you're going to hell. Everybody's on the same path to God. But after a while, if you go so far out here, without hitting my colleague, you don't have an identity. So this is a human problem. Where are you going to position yourself so that you have an identity? You're not just a melting ice cube or a melted ice cube, right? You're still a self with an identity. You have a group, but you're not, killing everybody. Without hitting my colleague here, you're not killing everybody. This is a human problem, and I think, I believe it was you who said that when we think about ISIS or ISIL, whatever, right? You suggested that we don't even demonize them, because once you demonize them, you stop thinking about them, you stop trying to understand them, you've othered them. And you seem to imply that maybe some dialogue could be possible, at least with part of the members. See what they, notice that they're a group of humans, And I think that's very important to remember that they're not a group of people that they're not beasts that hate. They must love something a lot, right? To do what they're doing, they must love something a lot. And yeah, they're exclusivists, and yeah, their methodology is horrific. But we should be able to connect with them on some there must be some way to connect, right? We're all humans. So once we other them, I think all is lost, actually.
If if I could also address that, and this might be my own personal, it's not possibly, it is my personal opinion on the issue. But I think that what you talk about, I mean, you should, in my class on nationalism, we've spent a semester talking about the issue of nationality, nation states, and we haven't come up with any clear idea, only to confuse ourselves even more. But the one thing that I think is true is that the idea of a nation state and nations and national identity is a very recent modern phenomenon.